Welcome to the 22nd Annual Conference of the Association for Heterodox Economics. We're doing it online because of COVID-19, and given that the theme is the world transformed, heterodox economics globally, we actually think it's quite a nice time to try doing this online. But bear with us, we had some technical issues, that's why we're starting a little bit late. But it's nice that it's more accessible this way to people across the world. This plenary in particular is about heterodox economics globally. Parts of it are going to be recorded. You as an attendee won't be recorded, you're on mute and your audio is, and your video is off. And we will post the recording at the end of the conference on our website. There's a Q&A box that you can see on your screen where you can ask questions. So the panelists will be answering the questions that are submitted there. You can also upvote questions in the Q&A box. So if you see a question that's similar to what you're wondering about, just upvote instead of asking another one. And then I'll, as chair, pick the most popular questions at the end. And we'll take all the questions at the end. So it would be great if you, when you write a question, if it's for someone who's presenting first, just mention who the question is for. So it'll be easier at the end. Those who are on Twitter can find us on AHE 2020 today. If you're having any tech support issues, you can write in the chat. Miriam Kennett, my colleague from AHE, is on tech duty, so she'll be able to help you. My name is Ingrid Kvangraven. I'm on the management committee of the AHE. And I'm here today with Rama Salla Dieng, Ndongo Samba Sylla, and Dora Barrancos. And I'll give the floor to them in a second. But first I want to say a few words about who they are. So Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla is a development economist. He's a research and program manager at the West Africa office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar, Senegal. And he previously worked as a technical advisor of the presidency of the Republic of Senegal. And his research covers topics such as fair trade, labor markets in developing countries, social movements, economic and monetary sovereignty. And in 2014, he published the book, The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich. And more recently, he published The Last Colonial Currency, A History of the Franc CFA with Fanny Pigeot, which should be coming out in English very soon with Pluto Press this year, actually. So he'll be presenting on COVID-19 and the economics of delinking, an African heterodox perspective. And after that, we'll have Dr. Dora Barrancos present, who's a researcher, sociologist, historian, feminist, and politician. And she's currently a national senator-elect of the city of Buenos Aires in Argentina. And her research covers the development of feminism in Argentina, social movements of the early 20th century. And she was for a long time professor at the University of Buenos Aires at the Faculty of Social Sciences. And from 2000 to 2009, she was the director of the Interdisciplinary Institute of Gender Studies. Between 2010 and 2019, she was the director of CONICET, which is the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. She's written 13 books, whereof the most recent was on morals and sexual behaviors in Argentina, 1880 to 2011. And it was in 2019 that she won a seat as a senator for Buenos Aires for the coalition Frente de Todos. So she'll be presenting on women and the labor market in Argentina before, during, and after the pandemic. And finally, Dr. Rama Salla Dieng is a lecturer in African Studies and International Development at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. She's on the Governing Council of the Development Studies Association in the UK, where her role concerns decolonizing development studies. And her research is at the intersection of feminist political economy and critical agrarian studies with a focus on land, labor, and social reproduction, food, and capitalism in Africa. And she previously worked at the Dakar-based African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, EDEP, as well as the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And this year, Rama published the book, Feminist Parenting, Perspectives from Africa and Beyond, with Andrea O'Reilly. So she's presenting on building back better. Why do we need a decolonial feminist development alternative? So I just wanted to take some time to say a little bit about them because their backgrounds are so impressive. But I won't speak anymore now because I'm very excited to hear from Ndongo first. So Ndongo, I'll give the floor to you. So 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ingrid, and good afternoon to the participants and also to my co-panelists. It's a real pleasure to have been invited by the Association for Heterodox Economists. And yeah, I'm glad also to have Rama and Dora in the same panel. Yeah, this is wonderful feminist panel. Yeah, as I like to think myself as a feminist. Yeah, solidarity with feminism, global South feminism. Yeah, so my presentation will be about COVID-19 and the economics of Rethink and African heterodox perspective. I just read my presentation, so as time is short, 15 minutes. Yeah. Economics is often perceived as a suspicious science by African populations who find it far too remote from their daily concerns. There is indeed a significant gulf between what African economists say and the living conditions of the majority of their fellow citizens. Of course, when we talk about economists in general, we are talking specifically about neoclassical economists. Their views dominate the mainstream media. In most African countries, heterodox economists are counted in units, while conventional economists are counted in thousands. Even if quantity does not always mean quality, numerical dominance still has a non-negligible effect on the direction of public debate. However, a welcome development is that the coronavirus pandemic had created a window of opportunities for heterodox economists to seize. There are at least two reasons for this. The first is that the pandemic has shattered many myths held by African political leaders and their neoclassical economic advisors. The second is that there is a widely shared perception that a paradigm shift is needed. Yet neoclassical economists seem to have nothing to offer except business as usual. This type of context facilitates the exploration of alternative ideas and approaches. In Senegal, for example, the country I come from, the pandemic has opened the eyes of our compatriots to many things. In particular, it has lifted the corner of the veil on the inadequacy of our economic model. Before the pandemic, the official discourse was that monetary sovereignty is not important. For the Senegalese government, not having its own currency and using instead a currency controlled by a foreign power is a guarantee of stability rather than a political and economic handicap and a renunciation of its sovereignty altogether. Similarly, the fact of incurring massive foreign currency debts was seen as a guarantee of credibility and a signal of confidence on the part of the financial markets. With the pandemic, Senegal found itself unable to create domestic room for maneuver to respond to the economic and health challenge. As a result, it turned to the IMF and is one of the rare African countries to demand the cancellation of the African continent external debt. People who don't really know anything about monetary matters rightly ask themselves, why are we suffering when France holds half of our foreign exchange reserves? Why doesn't the central bank in our monetary zone do as the central banks in which countries do? Before the pandemic, the official discourse sang the virtues of so-called free trade. We are in an open world. We cannot close ourselves off. It was said that infant industry protectionism is outdated. This is why Senegal, a country that records a chronic trade deficit for more than 50 years, decided to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union, despite the fact that it was under no obligation to do so, and despite the contrary opinions of civil society organizations and government experts. With the pandemic, the government suggested that everything that can be produced locally should be produced locally, including sanitary equipment. Unfortunately, it seems that this is only a rhetoric of circumstance. The proof is that the rice that was distributed as food aid was imported from Asia when it could have been produced locally by Senegalese farmers. Before the pandemic, official discourse celebrated Senegal's economic performance, which was then described as a country on the path to so-called emergence. What Karl Polanyi called the belief in the self-healing virtues of unconscious growth reigned supreme. Any criticism of the inadequacy of the economic model could be silenced by the high GDP growth rates of around 6% per year for the last 7 years. Yet, before the pandemic, it was clear that the economic growth achieved over the past decade had not created net jobs in the modern sector. With the pandemic, it became clear that this growth had not provided the vast majority of urban and rural households with access to safe drinking water without frequent interruptions. It was also realized that the government has neither the means to organize a lockdown nor the means to provide the necessary health assistance. In other words, setting aside the bravery and dedication of the health personnel, nothing has prepared us to face the pandemics in the best possible way by relying first and foremost on our own resources. Instead of saying that the king is naked, we should say that with the pandemic, the growth of the Senegalese economy is naked. It has had no tangible meaning for the vast majority of our citizens. Senegal is not an isolated case. What I have just said about it, except for some nuances, is valid in most African countries and even in some other countries of the global south. In my opinion, the pandemic has shown the inadequacy of the economic strategy that has been followed by African countries until now. This strategy, let us call it the economic catch-up strategy. It is based on the belief that it is desirable and possible to move towards the same levels of per capita consumption as the West. On this basis, free trade and dependence on international finance would be the preferred means of achieving this economic catch-up. Finally, the agent of this economic catch-up would be a state that tries as best it can to conform to the canons of liberal democracy while being coached by the development community. In other words, the strategy of economic catch-up rests on two main means, free trade and international finance, and on one executive agent, the state adopting the form of liberal democracy. In what follows, given the time available, I will not have time to engage in a critical discussion of the limits of free trade and international finance as recipes for development. Nor will I be able to discuss the dead end associated with the importation of the forms of liberal democracy into Africa. I will focus on the hypothesis of economic catch-up, a prerequisite for understanding why a strategy of delinking is necessary and what it entails. The hypothesis of economic catch-up assumes that the peripheral countries will one day be able to have the same level of per capita consumption as the central countries, the richest ones. However, since we have known almost 50 years ago that the idea of infinite growth in a finite world is a logical absurdity and a practical impossibility, we have also known that any attempt to extrapolate the Western standard of living to the whole of humanity, must lead to the collapse of human civilization. Paradoxically, the only way for the West to maintain its lifestyle is to prevent its generalization to the rest of the world. Indeed, economic catch-up does not only imply the convergence of per capita consumption levels, but also the convergence of per capita waste levels. However, since our planet cannot support the generalization of waste and destructions of resources characteristic of the Western lifestyle, economic catch-up is logically and practically impossible. This last observation does not imply that the global South is condemned to fall under the yoke of poverty and inequality, but only that the development trajectory of the West is not reproducible by all. There are in particular two specific reasons for this. First, the economic development of the West that took place in the period that some call Anthropocene and others more incisively call Capitalocene was based on ecological exceptionalism. Let's even be even more precise. This development was based on ecological imperialism marked by the monopolization of humanity's resource for the benefit of the West and also the externalization of ecological damage to the non-Western world. Today, the European Union consumes 20% of humanity's resources, even though it represents only 7% of the world's population. If everyone on Earth were to have the same standard of living as the average European Union citizen, we would need 3 planets. Unfortunately, we only have one. Second, the reason why the West's development trajectory is not reproducible on a large scale is that it has relied on the destruction of its peasantry, which now accounts for only a small proportion of its labor force. When Europe underwent its industrial revolution, it was unable to absorb its surplus labor released by agriculture. However, unlike most of the countries of the global south today, Europe was able to export its surplus labor to the Americas in particular. In Africa, while agriculture employs at least 50% of the labor force, any attempt to replicate Europe's economic trajectory is doomed to failure. And the most obvious sign of this is the meteoric development of the so-called informal sector. The huge mass of workers freed by stagnant agricultural sectors since the 1980s has been matched by the growth of very precarious jobs and the growth of shanty towns. As industries are either non-existent or too capital intensive, they could not absorb the labor force released by agriculture, especially in the context of sustained population growth. Policies of free trade and dependence on international finance are a way for the countries of the South to finance their own deindustrialization, to use perhaps Patnaik's suggestive formula. They reinforce a type of economic structure in which a stagnant agriculture, a stunted industrial sector, and an overdeveloped service sector dominated by the informal economy coexist. When we realize that economic catch-up is a myth, as Celso Furtado and others pointed out almost 50 years ago, it becomes important to think about an alternative that allows for an accumulation that is self-centered, egalitarian in its socioeconomic impact, ecologically sustainable, and democratic in its implementation. This alternative economic strategy is more relevant than ever. It has a name, delinking. Samir Amin described its principles in the 1980s. What is delinking? It's a middle ground between autarky and peripheral integration in a globalized economy. It consists in giving priority to the domestic demands of popular masses over the dictates of the globalized economy. In practical terms, it involves at least the following 5 orientations. First, the local control of the reproduction of the labor force. This means, for example, that the incomes of the peasants who constitute the majority of the labor force must be determined at the national level instead of being subject to the erratic evolution of world prices of agricultural products. Second condition, the domestic market should be largely reserved for national production. This implies going against the logic of free trade, which leads to the internal economic disarticulation of peripheral countries and the privileging of long value chains. Thirdly, the local control of natural resources. This implies control of the conditions of their exploitation, the income derived from them, and the articulation of the extractive sector with the rest of the domestic economy. Fourth, the local control of technologies, which means implementing innovation systems that provide practical solutions to mobilize local resources and reduce technological dependence on the outside. Finally, the local control of the surplus centralization to conquer more monetary and financial sovereignty with a view to directing domestic investments towards priority sectors and the sectors most important for long-term development. This implies less dependence on international finance, limiting integration into the global financial system and therefore setting up capital controls, and also fighting against forms of tax evasion and tax avoidance by multinationals. If one understands why economic catch-up is an illusion, one should also be able to understand why a delinking strategy is unavoidable for African governments wishing to obtain more economic and monetary sovereignty. The good news is that African peoples have shown significant resilience and creativity during the pandemic. Just look at the many inventions here and there that have emerged since the virus first appeared. The bad news is that the ideology for economic catch-up through free trade and dependence on international finance continues to reign supreme. While the pandemic calls for a radical paradigm shift The response of African authorities and orthodox economists advising them has so far to focus on greater integration into the global financial system and also on the African continental free trade area, an initiative originally to be launched for this month before its postponement. With regard to the dominant economic orientation among African decision makers and to the numerical and political weakness of heterodox economists, the strategy of delinking is still a distant possibility. However, we should probably not underestimate the capacity of African people to shake up the agenda of the dominant classes, especially as they are thirsty of radical economic ideas. Thank you for your attention.
Much. That was really, really good. So I'll hand the floor over to.
There have been reports mentioning jobless growth. Do we need, how do we interpret that? The latest quarterly labor force survey of the South African government is mentioning 30.1% of unemployment rate, and this is affecting mostly young people. And as I said earlier, the outcomes of the crisis will affect GDP growth rate, with a decline expected from 3.2 to 1.8 in the best case scenario, according to the Economic Commission for Africa. Public debt is also expected to rise. New capital is needed. There is a crisis of social reproduction. Titi Bhattacharya has mentioned that we are seeing more interest toward maximizing profit than maintaining life. And that is not only in Western country, but also in countries like Senegal, as Ndongo has mentioned, and as Dora has also just mentioned. So it's not just a social, it's not just a contradiction between the social and reproductive nature of capitalism, but it is a crisis of care, as Nancy Fraser has shown us. So why am I calling for a feminist and decolonial approach to interpreting the outcomes of the crisis, not only interpreting them, but also finding a policy response to it? So the influences are coming from feminist economics, agrarian political economy, African studies, social reproduction theory, and Marxian political economy. I think it's it's a huge mix of theories here, but when we are talking about economic, when we are talking about heterodox economics, it also means pluralism in theory, pluralism in methods, but pluralism of disciplines as well. And this has been reflected by the latest, by okay, I have read some books on the heterodox economics, and Morgan and Emery are telling us that heterodox economics cannot be reduced to a critique of the mainstream. Its purpose is more important, irrespective of the degree of innovation within the current mainstream. And coming from a development studies background, the critique that I'm formulating is that development and how we envision it has a double legacy. The first one is colonialism, which is still surviving through coloniality. And we see that low and middle income countries are mostly formerly colonized countries who used to receive aid. And most developing or development practitioners turn to come from countries which were former colonial administrators. And this is a contradiction that has been highlighted by Uma Kotari. And what I'm noticing as well as an African feminist is that there are dualism in how we conceive the economy and how we conceive development. in the sense that, especially in Western ontology, there seems to be a differentiation between production and reproduction, what is considered as market economy and what is a non-market, what is masculine and what is feminine, the man versus nature. And this is something that Southern scholars such as Ife Amajume, Yuval Davis, and other scholars such as Todorova have criticized. They have mentioned, for instance, Ife Amajume has talked about the fluidity of gender. Yuval Davis have talked about how class and race are not states, are not fixed. They are processes. They have conceptualized sexuality as well as a process. So what does this mean for how we formulate policy responses to COVID and how we try to have a decolonial approach to COVID? Okay, sorry, I'm trying to reconnect. There is a feminist political economist, Zein El Abidine, who is talking about the centrality of caring labor. Nancy Folb, Titi Bhattacharya, and in our last book with Andrea O'Reilly, we also mentioned how parenting and all the care services are central to a society's daily and intergenerational reproduction. And Zein El Abidine also mentioned the ways in which context matter for theorizing development. South African feminist Lebogang Feko talks about ethics, an ethics of love and an ethics of relationship. So where feminist political economists ask who does what, who gets what do they do with it? Or decolonial feminists ask also the question of relationship, the question of how we relate with nature, how we relate with each other as a central part of our being. And that's something that's missing. So why do we need a decolonial theory? I think decolonial theory allows us to ask where the theories that we are using, whether it is regarding development, growth, degrowth, etc., where are they coming from? The question of subjectivity, who is habilitated to say that this is theory or this is science? There is also the question of positionality as researchers. How do we include or exclude others, other ways of being, other ways of knowing, and other ways of doing? So I think decolonial theory allows us to have something that feminism alone or critical race studies alone or post-colonial critique alone cannot give us. So it's not just about add and steer. It's not just about formulating a policy and afterwards remembering that it's not addressing the needs of youth or the needs of women, for instance. It's not about that. It is about pluralism. It is about challenging power. It is about having a gender transformative, not gender responsive, gender transformative approach. So to me, a decolonial approach is also committed not to commit epistemic violence. It also value experience. When we talk about heterodox economics, if I came today and I said, okay, I am researching land grabbing because my mother's land have been grabbed, is this considered as a valid source of, source of knowledge? Or, you know, it's not figures, it's not quantitative, but it's something that I have lived and that informs my approach to addressing lands and my approach to the economy. And it is also a reflexivity on one's potential cognitive colonialism. So I'm now talking about what I learned with feminist political economists such as Naila Kabir, Georgie Sikata, Waylin and Rai. It is that the contribution of feminist economics is of at least 4 nature. The first one is recognizing the gendered nature of economies and understanding that economic crises are also crises of social reproduction, finance, and production. Secondly, it is also evaluating the distributional impact of economic policies on women's rights. Thirdly, investigating global shifts in women's work and their localized outcome. And finally, rendering visible the unpaid care work and its benefits for family, communities, and produce evidence on how policymakers are or are not addressing this. I am mentioning this because this afternoon I was supposed to speak first, and because I've had a family issue, I am now speaking last, and I am doing babysitting at the same time. So the fact that nurseries have closed for at least more than 100 days now have affected all of us in different ways. The crisis of caring, the crisis of unpaid care work has also shown its limit. So what am I proposing now? I think there are at least 3 dimensions that require an urgent response as far as economic policies or feminist economics are concerned. The first one, and I'm talking mainly from Senegal, which I know best, is addressing governance and justice. Because what we have seen is that with the curfew that has been adopted by the Senegalese government, for instance, it went with measures, exceptional measures, and all this led the state to concentrate exceptional powers and articulate that with everyday politics to have access to biometric data of its citizens, to have more police brutality has been noticed in Senegal, for instance. So how do we address governance and justice in time of crisis? How do we make sure that those who are responsible for protecting us are not using it for abusing us? Then secondly, I think there is a need to rethink the worth of work. What does it mean to, we have seen, what does it mean to be an essential worker? We have seen who has been defined in the UK, for instance, as an essential worker and who is not. Whereas those who are really at the front line of, covering, caring, and protecting those who are most in need have not been recognized for the work that they are doing. So who is in charge of recognizing what is worth pay and who is left out? So I think when we are talking about building back better, it is also a question of recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care work. So thinking about repoliticizing care work and collectivizing it, not leaving it alone in the hands of those who are doing it. How is the state how do we revive social economics? How do we revive feminist economics, especially in this time of crisis, in order for them to be able to deliver? Then finally, I think we need to think beyond COVID. Because when COVID is already, we need to organize beyond this moment and organize beyond Beijing 25. How do we build economic resilience? How do we have social safety nets, as Dora has mentioned, for women and youth and other vulnerable categories? How do we really repoliticize this project? I think we need to explore alternative within development, but also alternative to how development is conceived, or our project for development. And this means acknowledging that there are other ways that are more sustainable, that are more inclusive, that we need to explore. But decolonizing and having a decolonial feminist approach also means conceiving the policy space of the state, conceiving self-reliance. As Ndongo have said, the extractive nature of our economics who is not prioritizing people's need and centering on our own priorities is not sustainable. So how do we build our capacities to mobilize resources locally in times of crisis rather than expecting from external partners to help us? How do we develop our self-reliance and resilience? But also it is about, and I think it was a panelist from last Friday who said we need to talk about creativity, pockets of creativity. We have seen in Senegal, for instance, young people who were conceiving a robot to distribute medicine in the hospitals. We have seen a project titled 100 000 étudiants, who is aiming at, reviving, or how can I say this, mobilizing students' active citizenry into finding a collective solution to the problem. So how do we build on those costless, mostly frugal and social innovations? And finally, and this is really a response to Julia Steinberger. I really loved her presentation last week. She mentioned that development and growth and degrowth are not opposite, but co-requisite. I would like to ask her, I would like to agree with her, but at the same time, maybe insist that yes, they are not opposite, they are co-requisite, but provided that they center on each society's need and development vision. It means that we can no longer have one country deciding what should be the priority for another one. And finally, if you are interested in decolonizing development, I invite you to join the Decolonizing Development Study Group. Thank you. I have tried not to repeat what Ndongo and Dora has already said. That's why I left a few things out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was really good, and so many connections to the rest of the conference. All that while also babysitting. It's very impressive. So I talked to the chairs for the next session, so we have permission to go a little bit over. So I think we'll just take one question for each, and then if you have any additional closing remarks, you can also make them while you answer the question. So there's quite a lot of questions if you look in the Q&A box, but I will go for, so a lot of them are for Ndongo and they overlap a little bit. So I'll go for the one that got the most votes, by Carolina Alves, who wrote for Ndongo. Could you expand on what would be an economic strategy that is environmentally suitable for African countries? More specifically, in your view, what is the main aspect that should be first challenged in the current free trade international finance strategy? It's just a small question. And then for Dora, there is a question from Daniel Guiso. What is your view about the Argentinian Universal Child Allowance Program in fighting gender inequality? You mentioned the program in your talk, but is it effective in your view, as many cash transfer programs are simply a smokescreen when it comes to tackling gender inequalities and issues suffered by women in the labor market? And then for Rama, there were a couple of questions as well. And oh, there were equal votes, but okay, let's go with the first one then, by Beatrice Alamand. What is epistemic violence and how does a decolonial approach deal with it, in opposite to, for example, a neoclassical approach? Okay, thank you. Should we go in the same order as before? So Ndongo, do you want to start?
Thank you, Ingrid, and yeah, congratulations to Dora and Salla for their remarkable presentations. Thanks also to Carolina Alves, Dr. Carolina Alves, for her question, and I extend her my greetings and my admiration for the amazing work she's doing for rehabilitating heterodox economics with you, Ingrid, as well. Yeah. In my view, free trade is a way of disarticulating first African economies. That is maintaining them, let's say, through primary specializations. That means basically doing just activities that maintain them at the level of poverty. And those kind of activities could not allow those countries to create jobs, and those kind of activities do not have spillover effects over the rest of the economy. That's why generally, yeah, free trade is not the answer. We have to rely more on a kind of integration between African countries, not based on competition, but rather based on emulation to address common challenges. For example, we know that we have a deficit in terms of food production, while we have, let's say, available lands and available workers. We have also a deficit in terms of energy production. And I think we could set in place some initiatives which, rather than follow the principles of free trade, help us address collectively challenges like that, food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, renewable energy sovereignty. That's the kind of initiative I see which are for me preferable than free trade policies. And at the same time, we have to rely on local finance. The best we can do, we have to do it in local finance to the maximum of our domestic limits capabilities. But foreign finance, for me, it's not always the answer to our development challenges. I leave it there.
Perfect, thank you. Great. So, Rama, can you hear us? That's perfect.
Okay. So, what is epistemic violence, and how does a decolonial approach deal with it in opposite to, for instance, neoclassical approach? So what I was saying is that decolonizing economics is not only for neoclassical economists, not only for mainstream economics. It is also for heterodox economics. It is also for all social sciences. To me, epistemic violence comes with epistemic privilege. It means that researchers are the one who to define what matters and what does not matter, what counts as knowledge and what does not count as knowledge. It means that we need to leave the canon of Eurocentric and colonial knowledge construction in order to engage with other conceptualization and critique, other ways of knowing. It's not only, I've seen another question which is asking if it is qualitative or quantitative. I think it's not a matter of methods. It is in some instance, but it's not only, as we know, heterodox economics postulates pluralism in theory, pluralism in methods, and interdisciplinary pluralism. So it's not just whether to use qualitative methods or where to use quantitative methods. I think it goes beyond that. It goes beyond research methods. It goes to interrogate processes of knowledge production, what counts as knowledge, and who has the authority to define what counts as knowledge and exclude other ways of knowing. For instance, when researching global value chains and trying to look at employment, whether quantitative methods in economics, which is seen as the gold standard, can be, complemented by other methodologies that would be more participatory, that would be including the communities and allowing them to define what should be the center of the research, for instance. So how does, the question by Daniel, how do I understand the usage of different methods in that scholarship? Would this involve plurality of qualitative, quantitative, critical methods, or would this still assume a preference and a dominance of quantitative methods? So that's what I just said. It's not only quantitative or qualitative or mixed research methods. It's really centering the research on, first, the priority of the research participants, which are not just informants, but are also research subjects. So centering on what matters to those we work with, acknowledging their voices, not aiming to giving them voice, because that's a privilege, but acknowledging other ways of knowing, indigenous knowledge, songs, for instance, stories, other ways of knowing than the canon would consider as central. For instance, oral knowledge, etc. And then in what ways can a decolonial feminist approach create new forms of organizing economic relations? I think there have been studies that have been done on cooperatives, on other ways of organizing the economy, solidarity economy, for instance, but these are not the canon. I think in whichever way we decide to organize the economy, having a decolonial and feminist perspective means that we try and center on the priorities and the research interest of the communities with which we are working, decentering knowledge production from the West to the rest, bringing the margin to the center and bringing the center to the margin and see what that really means. I think it's important. And also organizing, as you know, feminist organizing is also about, is a struggle for interpretive power. As we know, and as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, it's about asking who does what, who gets what do they do with it, who has the power to set the agenda. So if you are not, as I say, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. So how do you manage, how do we manage not to have one table at which only a privileged, happy few have access to, but really conceive other ways of decision-making, more horizontal, more participatory, and more inclusive. I think that's something we need to think about. The last question, how do you view policies such as UBI? What is UBI? I am sorry, I don't know.
I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately.
I can't hear you. But now I understand how it works. I need to put this in order to hear you.
So I think we have to wrap up, but thank you very much. I let it go over time because there were so many interesting interventions. We have recorded parts of it, so that will be available on the website. And so the next session is on Global South Perspectives in Economics, and it's supposed to start at 3:30. Probably it'll be 5 minutes over. I put the link in the chat. Thank you so much to the panelists, all of you. And especially this last call, Decolonizing Economics is not just about the mainstream, it's about the heterodox economics as well. Yeah, it was great, lots of food for thought, and we'll hopefully keep discussing these issues throughout July. So, thank you.